As we come, Lord, to the book of Genesis once again, we're so thankful that we're not left in the dark as to where we came from and who we are and what our purpose is and who you are, most importantly, Lord, and what your plan is. And so this morning, especially as we look at this section of Genesis, we see why the world is the way it is. Lord, we see where all this sin comes from and where does death come from. And we're reminded of the fact that ultimately this world is broken apart from you. Lord, it's been broken by the fall, broken by sin, Lord, and yet you didn't leave us without hope. You didn't leave us without a plan, Lord, and ultimately your plan is to redeem all of creation to yourself, Lord, as we ultimately know as the story moves forward. And so, Lord, I pray that our time this morning in your word would just give us more confidence in you, confidence in your word, Lord, that you are the one who knows and sees what's going on and that it's your plan that's being brought to fruition, God. And so we thank you so much for the privilege that we have to see you and know you in your word. And ultimately, as always, Lord, we pray that your Spirit would open our eyes and cause us to behold wonderful things in your word, Lord. We pray that you would produce worship in us, Lord, as we look at it. And so we thank you and praise you in Christ's name. Amen. All right, good morning. Come on in. All right, so we are in Genesis, and last week we covered chapters 1 through 3 and really looked at kind of the purpose of Genesis as a whole. And so we're just going to pick right up in chapter 4. But before we do that, I just remind us, because obviously everything's building with what we began with. So what did we see really last week? Let's just kind of, I know it's early and we're all kind of getting our brains in gear here. So what were some of the key ideas from Genesis 1 through 3 that just kind of put it in the context in our minds as we jump into chapter 4?
Who the author was.
Yeah. So Moses wrote these books, the Torah, to the second generation of Israel. So they're about to go into the promised land. And so he's really teaching them who's their God, right? Who are they? And what is their purpose in life, right? And just focused right from the beginning on God's goodness, right? He's good. He created the world good. Sin is not a result of God. And it's obviously as a result of the fall. And so we could trust God. And that's one of the biggest lessons in Genesis is just the goodness of God and that he could be trusted. And we see that especially in chapters 1 and 2. Good. What else?
Written to the people about who God is and what their purpose is.
Yeah.
Right? So we looked at the Torah. We looked at the understanding that those first 5 books were from Moses.
That's right. Good. Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think in just understanding creation itself, and I think you used the word space and field, for example. God created the sky and then filled it with stars, and that kind of resonated with me, just see the order of this creation.
Yeah, that's good. Absolutely, Will. Yeah, just the order of God's creation, that he's good, he's purposeful in creation. Absolutely. Good.
It's a narrative work that is sequential.
Yeah, it's a narrative, so it's telling this story of creation and what God did. Absolutely. Good. All right, and then of course we came to chapter 3 as well, right, where we saw the fall, and we saw, where sin came from. We saw that sin is not a result of God, but ultimately this serpent tempted Eve, and she was deceived, and she fell. And yet we saw God's gracious provision that even after they sinned, they didn't immediately die. They did die spiritually, but God killed an animal and covered them in the place of them dying, right? And they responded ultimately in faith. Adam names his wife Eve because she would become the mother of all the living. And so we see that God's plan was not over because of their failure. And so really as we pick up now, we also, I guess one other thing we talked about is we saw kind of the outline of Genesis was laid out in these 12, we call them toledotes. That's a fancy Hebrew word. But I'm going to try to draw on the screen here. I got this new fancy gizmo. As we talked about, really Genesis can be broken up into 2 big halves. So 1 through 11, and then, now I'm getting too fancy. 1 through 11, and then 12 through 50. All right, can you see that? Is that kind of working? And so in 1 through 11, we really, did anyone remember what the focus is on? creation, kind of, it's global, right? So there's creation, and then there's the fall and the flood and the Tower of Babel and the Table of Nations. And so, through all of that, we see just how God is working out his plan globally, right? But then in 12 through 50, it narrows in, doesn't it? It narrows in on Abraham and God's plan to Abraham and his plan to work out, to save the world ultimately, as we're going to see in chapter 12. But within that, right, 1 through 11 is, we could even say it's a downward spiral of sin and death. We just see the results of the fall. And so chapter 3 really kind of sets the stage for 4 through 11 of, okay, the fall happened, and now we're going to see kind of that unravel. And we're going to see, ultimately, right, we get to the flood where God has to wipe out all of creation. We're going to see that, except for Noah and his family. We're going to see the Tower of Babel, where even after kind of this new recreation, so to speak, of the flood, that it's still not fixed, right? Because the problem is ultimately in the heart. And that's ultimately the whole storyline is going to be how God's going to go after our hearts. Okay, so does that make sense? Just kind of real briefly where we're at. So that really brings us, we're just going to dive into chapter 4. But we talked about these different, once again, these toledotes. There's 5 of them before chapter 12 and 5 after. And so that kind of sets this stage for chapter 12 being really the hinge. And so the whole section, we're going to look at all of 4 through 11 today. That whole section is really before chapter 12, and it's really showing the effects of the fall. Okay, so let's dive right into chapter 4. And we're going to have to move quickly through these texts, obviously, but we want to give you a big bird's eye view of what's going on here. So chapter 4, right after the fall, notice how it begins. Chapter 4:1. Now the man had relations with his wife Eve, and she conceived and gave birth to Cain, and she said, I have gotten a man-child with the help of the Lord. Now, just stop right there. In light of chapter 3, what do you think is preeminently on her mind at this point in the story? The seed, right? Because what did God just promise her? A seed, right? That would one day what? Crush the seed of the serpent. Crush the head of the serpent, right? And so, as she has a child, and we could see this kind of almost throughout the Genesis story, and even throughout the rest of history, that promise that God made that one day a seed would come and crush the head of the serpent, that's their hope. That's, in one sense, you could say at this point, that's the only hope that they have. That's the only promise that they have. That's the full extent of what they know of God's plans, that one day God's going to fix this, but it's going to be through a descendant of Eve, right? And so she has, Adam and Eve have a child, and they're like, okay, maybe this is it. That's probably, in the narrative, that's what the hope, that's what they're looking for, that's what they're waiting for. But as we're going to see, nope, not going to be the solution. This is Cain. And then she gives birth to Abel, and once again, we don't have time to kind of get into all the details of it, but, we know the story of Cain and Abel. And it comes about in the course of time. Cain brings an offering, Abel also brings. And there's kind of a debate of like what's wrong with Cain's offering, right? And we're not going to get too much into it, but I do want you to notice just from the text, what does the text emphasize about Abel's offering? He brought the what? The firstlings of the flock and their what? Fat portions, which is the best portion. Then it's what? The Lord has regard for Abel, but Cain, he doesn't, right? Now, once again, it doesn't, some people say, well, it's because Abel brought an animal sacrifice and Cain brought, an offering from the ground, wheat or whatever, right? But I don't think that's it, because what's emphasized in the text is that Abel brought the absolute best, and Cain, he just brought a sacrifice, right? He brought something, but it wasn't his best, right? So that's what's contrasted in the text between Cain and Abel, and so God is pleased with the sacrifice of Abel. Well, obviously, the story goes on, and we know that the Lord comes to Cain and says, why are you angry? Why is your countenance fallen? And then this is, I think this is such a key section here in this verse. If you do well, will not your countenance be lifted up? And if you do not do well, here's this phrase, right? Sin is crouching at the door, and its desire is for you, but you must master it. Once again, we're saying that Genesis is really laying the foundation for why the world is the way it is. And we saw this last week in Genesis chapter 3, didn't we? That we kind of saw what you could say the anatomy of temptation, right? That Eve saw with her eyes, this looks good for me, I want it. She didn't trust God. He didn't trust his goodness. She believed the lie of the serpent and she sinned, right? And she was deceived in that. And we see that in that the anatomy of sin, right, is it's tricky, it's deceptive, it's wanting our own way, it's not trusting God. But here I think this is another key passage that kind of gives us the anatomy of sin, doesn't it? What is this telling us about sin? It's crouching at the door, right? It's ready. It's really picturing sin like a lion, like you know, have you ever seen lions go on the hunt, right? I mean, they crouch down, they wait for their prey, and then all of a sudden they just pounce, right? And then they're off to the races like a cheetah or something like that. That's really the picture of sin, right? And for those of us that are sinners, right, which is all of us, don't we know that this is kind of how sin is? How many of us have been in a situation where, you know, you get angry and then it just, man, you get into argument, right? We've been there, and it's just like, it's mad. What is it? It's desirous for you, right? It's like this wild animal that overtakes us, right? Man, that's how our life is, isn't it? And once again, these opening chapters here are really trying to describe for us the effects of sin and death on the world. And so you could see here this sin is what? It's spreading, right? Adam and Eve's sin now is spreading. We're going to see it spreads through the whole world, doesn't it? So anyway, I think this is but what? You must master it. You must, and it's even interesting here. It's almost the exact same language of, you know, from chapter 3 about the woman and the man, and just like the woman's desire for her husband, but he's going to lord over her. And just once again, these are the effects of sin. This is what it does, is it puts things out of right order, right? Yeah.
I just have a question too. Would it be appropriate to also say that the anatomy of sin, even in Genesis with Eve and Cain, Eve and Adam, like in these accounts, none of them ever ask God for help.
Yeah, right. I mean, they're hiding their sin in Genesis chapter 3, you know, Cain and so here's the thing, right? God warns Cain. This is a warning, right? If you do well, and that even that word well there, it's good, actually, right? So in English, you know, good is a noun, but then if it's an adverb, we change it to well, right? So you do technically, technically good English grammar, you don't say you're doing good, right? Well, I guess you can. It means something different, right? You're doing well. You're doing that job well. But in Hebrew, it's the same word. It's good. So if you do good, will not your countenance be lifted up? So once again, you could put it this way. It's this cosmic battle between good and evil. And that's what we're going to see all throughout Genesis. Like good and evil are warring. There's a battle there. And ultimately, as we saw in Genesis chapter 1, humanity's at the center of God's creation. So really the battle is for humanity. Right, it's really this drama of redemption. You know, our humans, angels can't say either they rebelled or they're doing well. Really, the battle is for us and for our hearts. And so we're seeing this kind of drama of redemption. You know, this war of good and evil. Like it's about us, which is amazing. Okay, so but yeah, God in His grace, He warns Cain, right? But he doesn't listen, right? And so you know what happens. Cain tells his brother that he goes up into the field, tricks him into the field and kills him, right? And then once again, very similar to Genesis 3, right? The Lord says to Cain, "Where's Abel, your brother?" Right? And he says, "I don't know. Am I my brother's keeper?" Now that's another just great phrase, right? What do you think the implied? What's the right answer to that? Yes. And okay, so once again, who is this written to? Israel, right? The nation of Israel, as they're about to go into the promised land. You know, this is an important concept throughout the Old Testament. The book that comes to my mind about this is Joshua, is really focused on that, the very next book after the Torah. But really this idea of we're responsible for one another. Right? We're not independent, right? We see this really, it's in the Torah, but it's, very one of the main themes of the book of Joshua, but we see it right here, right? Yes, we are that's the irony of it. Like, this is literally your brother, right? And that phrase brother throughout, obviously into the New Testament, right, implies responds like, hey, we're brothers. We're responsible for one another. And so it's just kind of ironic. He's like, oh, am I supposed to care for my brother? Am I supposed to be, watching out for my brother? Well, yes, of course. Right? And that's the nature of sin, and just so distorts our vision that we don't see clearly, do we? And then, of course, God's like, what have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground. Now, this is sad but interesting. Notice this. Now you are cursed. Okay, do you remember Genesis chapter 3? Do you remember what we said about curses? We see the curse in Genesis 3. But do you remember what we said about Genesis 3 about cursing? What's that? The curse didn't fall on them, it fell on the ground. Right. So the serpent was cursed in Genesis 3. The ground was cursed, but Adam and Eve were not cursed. Right? So they were covered. Right? They were, with the sacrifice, and they were forgiven. And I believe, I think Adam and Eve will be in heaven one day. We'll see them. But I don't expect that for Cain, right? Just the nature, God in his wisdom, like his heart wasn't repentant. He's not, there's no sort of like, like when God comes to Cain, where's Abel? I don't know. What have you done? There's no response of like repentance and faith. And it's just, it just ends up like he's cursed. So, I mean, it could be wrong. That could be just like the narrative, what it's trying to emphasize. But, Cain is really the paradigm of an enemy of God, even into the New Testament, right? He's always the example, never of any sort of repentance or faith or, it's just the enemy of like, I'm consumed with my anger and I'm just going the way of sin, right? And so obviously God gives him this curse and he's like, it's all about punishment. It's too great for me. And God even then, shows him grace and puts this mark on him so that people wouldn't kill him. And God, Cain goes out from the presence of the Lord, right? That's kind of interesting there, right? He's no longer with the Lord and he goes off into the land of Nod east of Eden. Okay, so once again, just think of chapter 4. This is the results of the fall. This is all of our experience because we all inherit death. And so that's really, well, it gets worse, right? But anything about Cain and Abel at that point? Does that make sense? You tracking? All right. So as we continue on in the story, and we're gonna move on because we want to, there's so much we want to look at here. But Cain has relations with his wife. She conceives, gives birth to Enoch. He builds a city, and Enoch, Irad, and Irad, Mahulalel, and it just goes on. But then we come to Lamech, right? So here's, a few generations later. It skips lots of time, right? But what is what is this story emphasizing? Once again, just this downward spiral of sin. So Lamech, he takes 2 wives for himself. So now we get polygamy, for the first time, in the Bible. And he has these 2 wives, and, as he continues on, he gives birth. And anyway, it's explaining a little bit of just like where, like it talks about, he's the father of all those who play the lyre and the pipe and, who dwell in tents and have livestock. It's kind of talking about the development of culture as the world is, they're learning things and, just like today, right? We get more technology and things and they're learning how to do metallurgy and, iron and tools and, they're developing, that's part of kind of, in that sense, you see the creativity that was originally given to humanity, like continuing, but what? It's tainted, it's cursed, it's not how it should be, right? Because of sin, right? But anyway, you got bronze and iron here. But then this Lamech guy, right? He says to his wives, "Listen to my voice, you wives of Lamech. Give heed to my speech, for I've killed a man for wounding me and a boy for striking me." And he's just like boasting about murdering people here, right? And you could see it's like if Cain is avenged 7-fold, then Lamech 77-fold, right? So you see how bad it's getting, right? It's just like, Cain, of course, is horrible. It's murder. He murdered his brother. But it was, with Lamech now, it becomes almost trivial to kill someone. And we see this even in like gangster rap or whatever, right? Of just like, like murder and death, and it's glorified, it's boasted about, it's trivialized, right? And we know that that's just sin kind of run amok, right? And so, it's kind of an odd story to put in here, but you could see what Moses is portraying for us, right? It's just like, ooh, man, this is bad. This is ugly, right? This is the effects of death. Okay, well, I'll save that next comment for the next chapter. Okay, any questions about chapter 4? I know we're not covering every verse here, but you see what the chapter is doing here, right? It's showing just the effects of sin spreading. We're seeing how it's affecting humanity. We're seeing how we're not heading in a good direction, right? As death is spreading, and really death is spreading to everyone. That's what we're going to see.
That's good. Would you say that Lamech taking these 2 wives, first sign of polygamy, is also a sin?
Oh, absolutely.
Clearly, right?
Yeah.
So we can't use that as an excuse for polygamy.
Right.
Going through, people had,
Right.
David had several wives.
Yeah.
That kind of thing.
Yeah, I mean, we see that all throughout the Old Testament, right? And it's really, I think, just a sign of selfishness and sin. It's like not God's original design. Obviously, even in the New Testament, Paul looks back and it's like, or Jesus, right? It wasn't that way from the beginning, right? And that's what we see, like God's design, Adam and Eve, the 2 become one flesh. I mean, it's clear right from the beginning of Genesis. And once again, in the story here, him taking on 2 wives is a sign of sin, right? So it's not, and I think that's one of the things, people don't understand about the Old Testament. The New Testament is much more letters, right? And like instruction. The Old Testament is narrative. And you have to understand how to take narrative, right? This doesn't come out and say polygamy is wrong, but in the narrative, when you understand it in context, it's showing this is wrong. It's portraying it in a negative way, right? And so, a lot of peoples in the ancient peoples, like they did communicate through stories more, and we're not as used to that. I mean, we kind of are with movies, right? We kind of analyze movies like, oh, what's the point of this movie and things, but we're not used to reading stories this way like they were. But this, it's pretty clear, right? That polygamy this is not a good thing. This guy Lamech, he's not a good guy. He's not trusting God. He's not walking with God. So in the narrative, it's a pretty strong, statement against polygamy, even though it's not explicit. Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, John.
Does the text say where Cain's wife came from?
No, clearly these are all siblings and cousins, right? Yeah. So, even later, where was I just reading? Oh, just with Abraham and Isaac, they're marrying, basically cousins, right? He goes to his uncle and gets a wife, Isaac does, and whatnot. And really the whole idea of not marrying, close relatives, it's instituted in the law, right? And so, prior to that, and even just kind of like, once again, looking at it from our perspective, what's wrong with, marrying within your family? It's part of God's good design for us because of birth defects and things like that, right? Well, originally, our DNA was pure. It was not polluted. There was no, what's the word I'm looking at? Mutations, right? The gene pool was clean. But as time continued on, God gave that law for our good, right? Because defects and all these things started coming into our gene pool, right? And so, to delay the corruption of our DNA, right? God gave us this good law, like don't marry siblings, because just the way DNA works, if you have a recessive trait and you have 2 people with a recessive trait, then the trait is manifested, right? And so anyway, that's just part of God's goodness and caring for us. But it really wasn't wrong in the beginning. It became wrong as when God gave the law and said, hey, let me show you what's good for you. So it's even interesting, thinking about, once again, Genesis isn't a polemic against the theory of evolution, but it does tell us why the world came to be, and it tells us God's origin story, right? And our origin story, I guess you could say. It's just interesting, like from an evolutionary standpoint, humanity is getting better. But from a biblical standpoint, humanity is getting worse. And for me, this is very personal because I have a genetic defect. A lot of you know, right? I was born with it. I don't have a normal life expectancy. I've had open heart surgery, right? And it's passed on in my genes. It's like when I look at the gene pool, I'm like, no, it's not getting better. We're not like getting stronger, right? And we could see that. I think a lot of us, right? Now we have more technology and things, we have more knowledge, but as people, we're not getting more healthy, in that sense.
Which is the antithesis to, our culture, which makes so much about health and
Right.
getting better and you're gonna live
Right.
longer. But the Bible tells us that you have your years and your days are numbered and they
Right.
don't go beyond a certain span.
Right.
So when I see people passing away at, whatever that number God has given them, I'm not surprised.
Yeah. So anyway, once again, just kind of looking broadly, I would say the main point here is death is spreading and the principle of death. So that actually, yeah, Stephen.
I just wanted to ask, because I've heard it before, I just want to check if it's necessarily true, but especially through Genesis, there's often this narrative tool of moving east, basically meaning moving away from God or moving away from the presence or turning.
Yeah, I think that could be it. That could be valid. I'd have to study it a little bit more, to see does Moses use that, But that's an interesting. Yeah, I think that's a good observation. Yeah.
I was wondering what you meant by their creativity was tainted.
Well, God, going back to Genesis 1, God made us in his image. He gave us creativity, but we're not now because of the fall, because of sin, our creativity isn't just used for good, right? So, the fact that they're coming up with tools and metallurgy and songs, that's all good. That's creativity, right? But we're seeing here that Lamech, he was part of, this culture and whatnot, but he wasn't using all these gifts just to serve God and worship God for its intended purpose, right? So I'm not saying creativity is bad. Creativity is good, but we're not using our, that a good example of that would just be technology today, right? Our creativity to come up with computers and all this stuff, but wait a minute, are we really using our computers just for good? Or is really, we all know Facebook and all this kind of social media, it's actually depersonalizing and doing things that aren't healthy and aren't good for us, right? Not that people can't also use it for a tool for good, but sin corrupts, right? Even our good creativity, right? So yeah, that's a good question. Yeah.
So earlier there was the the verse that the Lord gave favor to Abel's offering.
Yes.
So does it imply that God is having favoritism?
Okay, yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, so Joel's asking this whole statement about with Abel's offering versus Cain's offering, and I think it says, I just want to look at the exact wording here. Where is it? Yeah. My translation says, and the Lord had regard, for Abel and his offering. And you're kind of saying it's found favor. No, I think what it's saying is God was pleased with Abel's offering, right? Because it was an offering from the heart. And it's telling us here that God looked at Cain and his offering and didn't find it pleasing. He didn't find it acceptable. And it doesn't say why, but actually, that's where I was saying the text actually emphasizes what God appreciated about Abel's sacrifice, right? That it was the best. He's worshiping God. He's like, God, you deserve the best. But it doesn't say that about Cain. That's the contrast in the text. And so the implied, I would say, lesson there is that the reason Cain wasn't accepted is because he wasn't bringing God his best, right? He wasn't thinking of God as worthy and worthy of worship. Right? And so it really had to do with his heart attitude, not, because once again, Cain worked with wheat. That was his job. Of course he should bring, even in the Old Testament, there was wheat sacrifices, right? There's nothing wrong with a sacrifice of grain, but the issue was his heart, right? He wasn't giving his best to God. That's what the text is emphasizing.
Do you also think, Pastor, that Hebrews 11:4 says, by faith, Abel offered to God a more acceptable sacrifice. So is it also he exercised faith in his offering?
Absolutely. So I would say there, the faith was to bring his best. Those two are tied together, right? Exactly. Whereas Cain, it was faithless, right? It's just he went through the motions, but there wasn't faith. There wasn't this worship. Yeah, absolutely. Good. Yeah.
So, in my perspective, I can see it's I'm looking as narrative.
Yeah.
But you're saying that having two wives is a sin, but yet incest is not. But at what point are you saying that came in the picture when this happened.
Right. Yeah, I understand what you're saying. Yeah. And I would say that, I mean, now incest is a little bit different because now you're dealing with your parents and so, I mean, you have to kind of define our terms here. But Adam and Eve's children, who did they marry? They married their siblings, right? And so that was part of God's design. That's just the nature of the fact that all of humanity came from one man and one woman. Right? So it wasn't sin. I think just logically, we could all say it wasn't sinful for Cain and Abel to marry their sisters, right? That was the only option. That's how God designed it, right? But at some point it became sinful, right? To marry your siblings. And I would say where that became sinful is in the law itself, because God then says, hey, for my people, I don't want you to do this. Now, I would say up to that point, it was okay.
But this is before that, isn't this?
Right. So that's why marrying your sister was okay, but polygamy is not marrying your sister. It's marrying two women, and it's not, part of God's good design here. And I would say, it's not explicit, but it's shown that it's not good by this character Lamech, right? That he is he's just living for himself. He's just living sinfully. And so it's really painting this as not a good thing. Like in the narrative, him marrying two wives is really, you would say it's an evidence of just sin running amok. So that's what I'd say the narrative function is of this section, just showing what happens when you just let sin run loose. Okay, good questions. All right, now chapter 5. Now this starts, once again, remember these Toledotes, right? So this starts a new one. This is the book of the generations of Adam. So in 2:4 said these are the generations of the heavens and the earth, and that generation statement, that's the one that we're calling, that's that Toledote. So now we're going to see this is what came of Adam. So that Toledote is basically, this is what came from, this is what the result of, and so you could see where it's kind of tracing what happened, right? So this section in chapter 5, this is what came of Adam and his descendants, right? And we know chapter 5 is basically a genealogy, right? But we're not going to skip over it because every genealogy in Scripture is there for a reason. And what we're going to see two quote-unquote genealogies today, and they're very different, and they have very different purposes. Okay, so once again, let's look at the opening couple verses of this chapter. We're not going to have to take super long with it, but I want you to see a couple things. So once again, this is what came of Adam. In the day when God created man, he made him in the likeness of God. So that right there, what does that remind us of? Creation. Okay, and this is important. And the reason it's important is this, because once again, what have we just seen in chapter 4? Death and sin just spreading, right? And what might be a wrong conclusion that we could come away from with that? Like death and sin. Well, we could come away from the fact like, okay, we're no longer in the image of God, right? It's just been totally destroyed. We're not in his image. And the text is showing us, actually, no. We're still, that's what's emphasized here. He made him in the likeness of God. He created them male and female. He blessed them, named them man the day when he created. And then notice this. When Adam had lived 130 years, he became the father of a son, what? In his own likeness. What is that telling us? His son passes on, like all humanity is made in the image of God, and that's being passed on. So yes, we are seeing sin and death being passed on, but we're also seeing us being created in God's likeness passed on. And this is just the dignity of humanity, the purpose of humanity, like being created in God's image to rule. What this text is showing us is that's continuing on. And that's kind of, once again, we talked about this idea of the drama of redemption, right? Like, as people, we can walk by faith and walk with God and be like God even. And we know just from the New Testament, right? We're made to be like Jesus. And so that's not lost in us, right? We're still made for that. It's not been, now sin, of course, corrupts it. It's got to be dealt with. And the whole storyline of the Bible is like, how is sin going to be dealt with, right? How is the serpent going to be crushed? And how is sin and death going to be destroyed? That's the story of the drama of redemption, is sin and death being conquered, right? Which we know ultimately is on the cross, right? But you're seeing here, like, wait a minute, we're still made in the likeness, and that's going to be passed on from generation to generation. Okay, so you could see you could say these first 3 verses of chapter 5 are very encouraging, aren't they? Because in the midst of all this death and destruction and sin that's spreading, all hope is not lost. Like, it's not all destroyed, right? So this section really reminds us of Genesis chapter 1, doesn't it? The whole thing. And it's reminding us that, okay, as humans, we haven't lost everything yet, Like, we've been kicked out of the garden, but we know we're heading back to the garden, so to speak. Okay, so that's those opening 3 verses. But now, if you read the rest of the genealogy, once again, we're not going to go over every verse, but if you read them, guess what you'll find out? It's incredibly repetitive, right? And the question is, what is repeated? So let's just start with Seth here. Okay, every single one of these follows the same pattern. Seth lived 105 years, became the father of Enosh. Then Seth lived 807 years, he became the father of after he became the father of Enosh. He had other sons and daughters. So all the days were 912 years, and what? He died. Okay, that's the repeated line throughout this. It's like, he did this, he had these kids, and he died, and he died. I mean, every one of them, right? Just keep reading it. What happens? And he died, right? I mean, what is this showing us? Everybody's dying, right? Like, death is spreading to all of creation, right? And so that once again, that's what we're seeing, is the spread of sin and death. And really, I would say the spread of death, this principle of corruption. We could do like kind of a whole theology of death. I would say that we sin because we're dead, right? Death is this principle of corruption. Like, when we're born dead. I mean, Ephesians tells us that. But we see that, I think, even here, that ultimately there's this corrupting principle that we're all born into, that, we talk about, like, we're born sinners, which is true, but I think this is a more fundamental idea, that we're born separated from God. We're born going our own way. We're born with corruption. And as a result of death inside of us, this principle of death, we sin and we die. Does that make sense? So it's flowing out of kind of this corruption. You could just think of death like that, like corruption. You think of like a dying corpse or something. It's like corruption just spreads, right? And it's not a pretty picture, right? But that's really the picture of humanity. Yeah.
I was just going to ask, is that what it means in Galatians when it says sowing to the Spirit leads to eternal life, but sowing to the flesh?
Yes, absolutely. Right? So Galatians talks about that. Romans talks about like death. Like in Romans 5, it talks about death reigned. Right? What do you mean death reigned? And it's talking about sin. It's talking about just this principle of corruption. So once again, that's getting, but Genesis is laying, we talked about this principle of progressive revelation. Genesis is laying the seeds. Like, Paul didn't get that theology out of nowhere. Right? It's like it's not as clear in Genesis as it's going to be in Romans and Ephesians and Galatians, but we're seeing this kind of theology here of death spreading. That's what we're seeing in Genesis 3 through 11, right? We're just seeing this corruption spreading, this sin spreading, and it's not explicit, it's in narrative form, but if you look at what is the author after emphasizing, and he died, and he died, and he died, and sin and Cain happens, and Lamech happens, right? And then the flood happens, right? We're just going to see this spreading corruption, and just that's the nature of sin and death. Okay, you with me? Now, just real quick, glance through the rest of this chapter. Are there any times where this pattern, someone lived this many years, became the father, then lived this many more years, had other sons and daughters, and lived this many years total and died? I mean, that's the pattern. Where is that pattern broken? Enoch. Okay, let's go to Enoch. Okay, because Enoch breaks the pattern. It doesn't say, and he died. Everyone's like, and he died, and he died, and he died. But what about Enoch? What happens with Enoch? Enoch lived 65 years, became the father of Methuselah. But here's what's different. Enoch what? Walked with God. Okay? That's not what the rest of them say. He walked with God, and what? He had other sons and daughters. So all the days of Enoch were 365, and that's where the and he died. But then what does it say again? You can't miss it. Enoch walked with God, and he was not, for God took him. Okay, once again, this is a narrative, but what do you think that right there is trying to tell us? Just connect what's different. Walked with God, and he was not, God took him.
Goodness, he didn't die.
He didn't die. Why? Because he walked with God. You can't miss that, right? You see that? So walking with God is the way to escape death. That's, I mean, once again, it's not explicit, but it's clear, isn't it? You see that in the text? Yeah.
No, I just have a question because you know that is there repeated like live and die, live and die, but it's like the numbers are getting lower and lower.
Well, it's kind of because now. Yeah, well then Methuselah though is, he lives, go back up there. So all before the flood, they're all living hundreds and hundreds of years, right? So that, Methuselah is almost 1,000 years. And that gets into its own thing of like the flood. After the flood, people stop living so long anymore. Yeah.
I always wondered, did somebody witness God take Enoch? Because I'm just thinking, people go missing all the time.
Right. Well, that kind of goes back, I don't know if somebody witnessed it, but this really goes back to, well, where did Moses get all this information from? And we talked about last time how he talked face to face with God and was able to ask questions to God. So we don't know how much, there was certainly some oral tradition that would have been passed down all the way to Moses, but a lot of this detail, the only way he could have gotten it is by talking directly with God. And the fact that Moses could talk face to face with God, that's this, once again, we're saying the Torah, these first 5 books of the Bible, they lay the foundation for everything, right? There's so much information. So, this is the biggest drop of revelation anywhere in the Bible, right? And to start it all off. And so that comes from Moses just talking face to face with God, like all this information that he received because of that relationship. Yeah.
You say this walking with God is a relationship with God by faith.
Yeah.
Comparative or conversely, these other people did not have. Would you
Exactly. Absolutely.
And like that, then, as we are walking with God in the New Testament, we will die but yet live again.
Yeah, absolutely. That's exactly the principle here, right? That because he's in relationship, and even this phrase walking with God, it's going to be repeated about Noah. It's clearly not just going for a walk, it's talking about a way of life, as you're saying, it's talking about a relationship. It's pretty obvious in the narrative here that it's talking about, well, even we talk about Jesus is the what? The way. The way is like this path. And so in the Old Testament, it's really pictured as, like you're saying, this relationship. When you're walking together, you're talking together, you're walking in step. There's a lot of, it's very poetic, right? Imagery of having a relationship. And so, this is going to, once again, it's not defined. It just says Enoch walked with God. But as the rest of the Old Testament and even the Torah unpacks, it's going to define that for us. What does it mean to walk with God? How do we walk with God? It's going to, obviously, God's going to tell us how to walk with him. He's going to give us the law and the sacrifices, and he's going to tell us, hey, here's how you have a relationship with me. So, this is going to be stuffed with information as the Torah continues on, right? Even in Deuteronomy is really where God's going to get very explicit. Here's how you walk with me. And so that's a great book to kind of, but it's very relational. You think about me and remember who I am and love me and, all these heart issues. Yeah, that's good. Hey, anyway, so we got death spreading, but there's still hope, right? There's still a way to escape death through walking with God. And then there's one other kind of exception to the pattern, right? Right here, Lamech lived 182 years, became the father of a son, and he called his name Noah, saying what? This one will give us rest from our work and toil. Like that work and toil, right? The ground which God has cursed, right? You see that language is the curse, right? It's Genesis 3. And once again, we're seeing rest, right? This kind of escape of death, so you're seeing a way to escape death, a way to escape the curse, right? And Noah, he's going to bring. So once again, there is death spreading, there's sin spreading, but we're not without hope. There's exceptions to the pattern, and of course we know, Noah. What's going to be said about Noah? He walks with God. Okay, so Enoch escapes death by walking with God. Noah's going to give us hope and rest because he walks with God, right? So we're seeing, some important truths as this story continues on. Okay? Anything else about chapter 5? All right. So we'll keep continuing. Now remember, this is the beginning part of chapter 6 is still part of the same section. Like the section break is in, a little bit later here in chapter 6. So now we really get into, this corruption spreading. Now it came about when men began to multiply on the face of the land, daughters were born to them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men were beautiful. They took wife for themselves, whomever they would choose. And then the Lord said, my spirit will not strive with man forever because he is flesh. Nevertheless, his days shall be 120 years. And then we get this, the Nephilim were in the, on the earth in those days, and afterwards when the what? The sons of God came in to the daughters of men, bore children to them. They were the what? The mighty men of old, the men of renown. Now, and then the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, that his every intent of the thoughts of his heart was what? Only, not just evil, only evil continually, right? So now we're really seeing just total corruption, right? Now, I don't have time to, completely unpack this. The Nephilim, the sons of God, but I will kind of explain what I think, why this is in the Bible. Okay, so the sons of God, that phrase it sounds like it could be people, but that phrase is only used of angelic beings in the Old Testament. And so I do believe, as crazy as this is, I do believe this is talking about literally demons, like in our language, in our terminology, demons somehow, whether it's they're possessing men and having relationships with women, or whether they're taking on human form, and I don't know, right? The text doesn't say, but somehow demons were involved in procreating with women, and what was born, there is these mighty men, these Nephilim, these giants, okay? These men of renown. And then, the Lord saw that the wickedness of man was great and evil. So this is not a good thing that's going on here. And ultimately, this is going to be, I would suggest to you, really at the heart of the cause of the flood, right? This is part of the reason why God has to wipe out humanity. Now, just real quickly, and I'm not going to even go there, if you want to talk about it afterwards, if I just had this text in the Old Testament, I think this is somewhat clear, but what makes this interpretation really clear is 1 Peter, 2 Peter, and Jude, which all reference this and confirm that it's talking about angels and demons, right? In 1 Peter, for example, he says, the spirits that disobeyed long ago in the days of Noah, right? What spirits disobeyed? It's these spirits, okay? So, and then Jude talks about it. Anyway, I'm not going to get into that, but I'm convinced that this is the right view. Now, I know we have all kinds of questions about that, but what's more important is, why is this in the text? What is this showing in the narrative? So I want you to stop for just a second, think about the narrative as we've seen it so far, right? And how does this fit into the narrative? What is this doing in the story? You with me? Anyone? What? Yeah.
Like the element of the work of Satan still.
Okay, yeah. So we have this good versus evil, this battle, this satanic battle between good and evil, between man. Yes, absolutely.
And the seed, maybe the seed.
Absolutely. Okay, so you with me? Like, if we're thinking about the story, all we know so far is there's this battle between good and evil, and what's going to be the ultimate triumph of good?
God crushing the head.
God crushing the head of the serpent through the seed of the woman. Okay, what I believe is happening here is that there's satanic opposition to the line. The human race is being corrupted. Like, just, like with this satanic, demonic procreation that's kind of anti-God's way, anti-God's spirit. And once again, like, this is why God had to wipe out the earth and start over. Right? And actually, once again, Genesis doesn't tell us this, but the New Testament tells us these demons that did this, they get locked up so that they can't do this anymore. And right, and ultimately they're going to get let out of the abyss. And there's a whole theology of that. The New Testament talks about that. That's not our point here, but it's because this can't happen. Right? If humanity is corrupted with this kind of satanic line, if you will, right, then the seed, is not going to be pure. And so just imagine, these men of renown, whatever, like they just intermarry and keep mixing and spreading. And eventually it's going to taint the whole human race with kind of the demonic line, if you will. Let's just call it that. Okay, so you see what's in the narrative, you see Satan, the serpent, is opposing like directly what the plan is. He's going after the seed. He's going after, once again, humanity. Like God wants to redeem us and Satan doesn't want that, right? So, this is a big theme in the Torah. Like even when you get to Exodus, right? What do you have? You have Moses and Pharaoh going head to head, but really it's a battle between Yahweh and the gods of Egypt, right? And there's this good versus evil. There's this battle, right? So Genesis is really showing from the beginning, there's this battle between good and evil. And we're not dualists, right? We don't believe that Satan and God are kind of like equal and they're, it's like the yin and the yang, kind of like Chinese theology or whatever, right? But we believe God is God and Satan is not equal to him, but there is still this, Satan is opposed to God, and there's this battle of good and evil. And you with me? And we're seeing it so clearly here in the text that, Moses is really unpacking and defining for us, this is our world. This is what we're living in, is this satanic opposition. So that's why you get to the New Testament. It's like, man, put on the armor of God. Satan is attacking us. Like, I think it's so easy for us to just kind of go about our lives and forget about the spiritual dynamic of it, right? To forget about, like, really we're a part of this story, this drama of redemption, which is a battle for human lives and hearts and souls, right? And it really puts it in kind of this cosmic perspective that we're not just kind of living our individual lives. We're part of God's story where he's trying to redeem and save humanity, and we could be a part of that or not. Right? We could support that or we could be his enemies, right? So once again, it's giving us a framework and a perspective for why we exist and what we're doing here on planet Earth, right? You with me? So pretty, once again, crazy story, but then when you understand kind of the theology of it, once again, I would say this is clear in Genesis. It's a narrative, once again, it's not explicit, but I think they were much more attuned to what a story was intended to communicate. It's just harder for us we're not used to that. Okay. All right. I shouldn't even ask that, right? Any questions? Yeah. Right. Yeah.
Well, it happens again though, right? Because we see giants come again.
That is a good question. And that's one of the big, because we do see giants later. And that's, I don't have an easy answer to that. There's two possibilities. One possibility is some of the other demons that didn't get chained up here, that weren't involved in this, do it again. That's not recorded in Scripture. That's one possibility. The other possibility is that, some people say, well, somehow there was some demon DNA that got on the boat with I don't think that, okay? With Noah and his sons. But the other possibility is that when the Israelites see giants, they're just relating it and saying, oh, they must be the Nephilim. He's saying it's a kind of, they're correlating it to this story, even though possibly it wasn't actually demon DNA, so to speak, right? So either one of those is a possibility, but I think the latter is probably more likely. When the Israelites go into the land, even Goliath, right? They see these giants and they're thinking of this story of this kind of demonic corruption, these Nephilim. And so in their minds, they're just like, that's what this is. And so it's more of a linguistic connection than actually like a physical DNA connection. So that would be, I can't say that the first possibility didn't happen really, but I would lean towards the second interpretation. That's as good as I got for you. Because I don't think, one of Noah's sons was somehow corrupted, or yeah.
It makes sense too. Doesn't Greek mythology and all that stuff together that allude to this?
Yeah, it's similar in some ways, yeah.
What is Nephilim? Is that the same as sons of God?
Oh, good question. So Nephilim just means the fallen ones in Hebrew, and they were these descendants of this, you could say, unholy union between the sons of God and the daughters of men, right? So, in other words, just to put it real plainly, somehow demons, whether they took human form or they possessed humans, they, had relationships with women and they had descendants, children from that. Those children are the Nephilim. So they're kind of this, once again, have this demonic DNA, if you will. That's just what I'm going to call it. I don't know that technically that's the case, but somehow, it's a mystery, but somehow demons were messing with the DNA. They're messing with, humanity. I don't know how, I don't know what that looked like, but the result of that was these giants, these mighty men, these warriors of old that were on the earth.
So the mighty men that's mentioning is a Nephilim.
Exactly. Yep, good question. Right, that's where it said, those were the mighty men who were of old, right? So the Nephilim, those. Yeah, good. Okay. All right, well, we got to keep moving here. And I'm going to get to the break here. Then Yahweh saw that the wickedness of man was great on the earth, and that every intent of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. And then notice this, Yahweh was sorry that he had made man on the earth, and he was grieved in his heart. Yahweh said, I will blot out man whom I have created from the face of the land, man to animals, creeping things, for I am sorry that I've made them. But Noah found favor in the eyes of the Lord, right? So the idea of favor here is grace. Same word, favor, grace. You could translate it either way. So you could see here, right? I mean, this idea that God was sorry that he had made man on earth, this gets into, and there's a lot of theology just right there, but we could definitely say this. The text is emphasizing that this is grievous. This is sad. This is, now, I don't think God is actually thinking, oops, I made a mistake. Okay, I mean, I think that's clear throughout the rest of the theology, even of Genesis, that God's not actually ooh, I didn't foresee this happening. Oops, I made a mistake. Let's go to plan B here, right? But the text does, there's a danger if all you emphasize is God's sovereignty, right? Everything is going according to plan, then you might be tempted to think that God is actually happy with the things that are happening, right? And the text is emphasizing very clearly God is not happy. Right? So there's theology there that's got to be worked out. Wait a minute, if God's in control, couldn't he have stopped this? Is he really in control? And I would say, yes, he's in control. We see that. I mean, Genesis is going to end. You meant it for evil. God meant it for good. God's working out his plan. He's in control. He's good. He's sovereign. That theology is all throughout Genesis. But if you only emphasize that, you're going to come away with the idea that God's in control and everything's going according to plan. Everything's good. And I say, no, that's a wrong conclusion. Everything is not good. Things are not how they're supposed to be. This world is broken and just a curse, and God's grieved and he hates sin. Okay, you with me? So while it's true theologically that sin is part of God's plan and ultimately he wants the cross to happen and he's about redeeming, that's true. But if that's all you emphasize, you're going to miss how much God hates sin, how grievous it is to him. Okay, obviously there's a mystery there. There's mystery even in this verse that God was grieved. But the text wants to communicate God hates sin. He's not happy with it. It's not good, my plan's going how I want it. Okay, yes, in some sense that's true, but not in the sense that the text wants to emphasize here. He wants us to understand, man, this is just brokenness. God hates it. He cares about us. He doesn't want to see just sin corrupting and destroying us. And I would even... we're going to take a break and then we'll get into the flood narrative. But I even want to stop here and say, I mean, the flood, right? I mean, we like Noah's Ark and nursery, we put in the nursery room. But man, we're going to see this is a horrific, God's going to wipe out the earth. I mean, it's not a pretty picture, right? And yet even that, God's judgment on all of humanity except for 8 people, even that we're seeing here is a work of grace. And the reason is because if you just let sin run amok, it's going to corrupt everything and all of humanity is going to end up, there's going to be no hope. There's going to be no redemption. There's going to be no salvation because sin is just going to consume us, right? So even the flood ultimately is God's work of grace. In the same way with God wiping out the Canaanites, right? That's horrific for them. That's judgment. It's righteous because God is righteous, but it's part of God's if you just let sin run amok, it will destroy everything, right? And we're seeing that. We see that in this story. Okay, you with me? All right, but then once again, grace. There's still grace, right? So as much as we're seeing this downward spiral, we're seeing sin and death spread, there's still grace, where there's still hope. God's plan is not done, and it's hanging on by a thread. But isn't that, I mean, just follow the story throughout the whole Old Testament. It's always hanging on by a thread. And there's always just a remnant. There's always, just one man that God's like, one righteous king, one, it's Josiah, it's David. It's never the majority, right? And that's always been God's plan, that his people are always in the minority, right? But God is gracious, and he's still working out his plan to save. Okay? All right, let's take a break, and we're going to come back and we'll hit the flood narrative.